Cool. So today we're just going to kind of quickly talk about a few best practices for chapter VPs. We're going to really focus in here on our chapter standards board best practices. And then at the end, we'll likely have a good amount of time if there's anything that you guys want to discuss or ask questions about or anything. So I'm just going to jump right in. So today we're just going to specifically talk about the duties of a chapter VP, a little bit about your chapter constitution and bylaws, and then really dive deep into chapter standards board. So duties of a chapter VP, this is what's in the national bylaws. The article might be different now. We just made a bunch of changes to the national constitution and bylaws, so I can't remember if this is still the same or not. But we do have an article in the national bylaws that goes not super into depth because it's not supposed to, but at least kind of overviews what the duties of a chapter VP should be at the national level. So local vice presidents preside at chapter meetings in the absence of their local president. They head the chapter standards board. They also help maintain the local constitution and keep an accurate record of member statuses. So since this is what's in the national constitution, your chapter constitution and bylaws may, put forth a few extra duties or something else that your chapter might say, oh, we want a chapter vice president to also handle this. So this is what's really required of a chapter VP at a minimum. So like I said, duties can vary from chapter to chapter. It might include some of these things that are in black I already mentioned. And then some of the things that are in fuchsia are, additional duties that you as a VP might encounter or be required to do as per your chapter's constitution, whatever it might be. So act as parliamentarian during chapter meetings. So hopefully we're using Robert's rules in our chapter meetings. And really that this role just helps keep all of our meetings on track and everything. Additional things here in fuchsia, so submitting the required national paperwork, maybe award applications, the current copy of your chapter's constitution and bylaws to HQ, mostly through OPA portal. You might be asked to chair your chapter's constitution and bylaws revision committee or a legislation committee of some sort. And then really it should be the duty of any officer on a chapter exec board to transition a newly elected, whatever that role might be, into the role at the end of your term. So when you're done, hopefully you are well prepared to transition whoever's taking over from you when they are ready. Any questions about these extra little things that might be things that you encounter? Cool. All right, let's move on then. So chapter constitution and bylaws is actually something that I really love talking about. I know that's a little crazy, but I have actually presented a bunch of workshops before at National Convention, also just with chapters in general about constitution and bylaws. So it's something I'm pretty passionate about. So your chapter constitution and bylaws are two separate documents, but they align with each other. So they're a living document. It should be updated periodically to align with the national constitution and bylaws. So just as we made updates to these documents at National Convention, you should be doing the same at your chapter. And most of the time, it should be outlined in your constitution and bylaws, how often things should be reviewed and updated. So when it comes to your chapter constitution and bylaws, we don't want them to conflict with the national documents. That's something that we always review all of our chapter docs to make sure that there's nothing that conflicts with what we've put forth in the national documents. We want to make sure that, your chapter documents are maybe potentially a little more strict, but they can't be less than what the national constitution says. So a great example would be we just passed an amendment at constitution or at convention that said potential new members need to log 10 hours of community service in their new member period. You can't say it's going to be 5 hours in your chapter constitution. You could say it's 15 maybe if you wanted to. Same with like individual service hours. So like you as a member, your chapter might say, we want all of our members to complete 25 hours of service, but nationally it's 10 hours. That's perfectly fine. Chapter can't say that it's going to be 5. So hopefully that makes sense. The chapter constitution and bylaws really just provide that framework for how your chapter should be run. So I like to think of the constitution as the document that is pretty set in stone. It shouldn't have to change a lot at all. Your bylaws are a bit more fluid. That's even the same can be said with our national constitution and bylaws. If you looked at the legislation we went through at convention, the vast majority of the amendments that were passed or proposed were to the bylaws, not the constitution, because the constitution should be that static stuff that shouldn't change, and the bylaws might change over time just with the needs of the sorority or your chapter. So your chapter constitution and bylaws should also be that reference point for all members of the chapter. You want to make sure that your members have not only just your chapter constitution and bylaws, but also the national, because we want to make sure everybody's familiar with it, understands how the chapter runs, what is expected of them, et cetera, et cetera. And then, as I mentioned before, right, revisions should really be made regularly. Hold on one sec. I think I see somebody. Oh, never mind. I thought somebody was trying to join our session. So revisions should be made regularly. Usually, like I said, it should be set forth in your constitution and bylaws when that might be occurring. But most regularly it happens at the end of a semester or school year, or at the beginning of a semester or school year. So I would just check your local constitution and bylaws to kind of make sure that you follow that, that timing and all of that to the best of your ability. I would even say nationally, we didn't really do a great job of this, at least like making sure that like everything was followed to a T for a long time. But now we've gotten into a really, really great cadence and some really great procedures on making sure that folks are able to submit proposed changes. And we have a whole process on how we go about looking at those changes and reviewing them, making sure they're, all good, and then considering them at convention. So it's really exciting. So next, we're just going to kind of talk about your chapter standards board. So this is going to be really probably the main focus of your role as a chapter VP. Chapter standards boards are kind of what we would like to think of as the judicial body of your chapter. These things here, CSBs help determine and improve membership status. So, those things when folks request a leave of absence, or maybe they need an emergency leave of absence. Maybe they want to request alum status, whatever it might be. Your board would help determine and approve those and discuss them. Chapter Standards Board also determines if members are violating any national or chapter policies and procedures. So we just recently removed the national policies from the national constitution to make sure that we can adjust them as the needs of the organization change. Great example, COVID-19 like totally upended everything for everyone, and our constitution and bylaws actually like had our hands tied in regards to some wonderful things around membership status and dues and all sorts of stuff. So those policies, now are kind of out of the Constitution, but there's still things that your members should be very well aware of because they are national things. Your chapter might have additional like policies and procedures that you put in place. So, CSB really enforces all of that. Maybe it's something around not meeting requirements, whether that's a financial or service, or folks are missing too many meetings, whatever it might be. CSB might also be, the group that would determine that, a fine is necessary for some sort of infraction that a member has made. So as a chapter VP, you are the chair of your chapter standards board. You're responsible for operating it in accordance with your chapter constitution and bylaws. And so we'll get into this a little bit more, but your CSB at Alpha Zeta chapter might be way different than at Gamma chapter, than at Phi chapter, wherever you are. But there are some kind of best practices in terms of what your membership should look like on the board and what things you should be doing. So we're going to go into those. So things to consider with your chapter standards board. These are questions you should probably ask yourself and determine if yes or no is the answer. So one is, does your chapter standards board truly operate how it's set forth in your chapter constitution or bylaws? If not, why? And if it's not, we should probably update that or get it updated. Make sure that, it's reflected in your bylaws or whatever, wherever it might live. This is how we operate. This is how the chapter standards board, it's chaired by a VP. These are the members, and how are the members chosen to serve? Next question, how are the members chosen to serve on your chapter standards board? So I am a Phi chapter alum, and when I was the chair of our chapter standards board, it was before we actually called it our chapter VP. We had an application process where folks, put their names forward, but we also had a few exec board members who were required to serve on chapter standards board. All of this was written in our constitution, and it still is. So make sure that, how folks are chosen to serve, whether they're appointed, they're elected, is documented in your constitution and bylaws. A big question that we get, and we have gotten much more recently, is how can you ensure that your chapter standards board represents your membership? I would say specifically when it comes to diversity and making sure that all voices are heard. I have a few tips about this later, so we'll get into that in a little bit. And then, do you know how to conduct a chapter standards board meeting properly? We'll, again, get into that in a second, so let's dive in. So who serves on your chapter standards board? These specific questions should probably be addressed in your chapter constitution and bylaws. So how many members are going to be on your chapter standards board? How many of those members are going to be executive officers? How many of them are going to be non-exec members? And then who else can maybe sit in on chapter standards board meetings, like as a voice of reason or for informational purposes? Who else can actually attend these meetings? So when it comes to who serves on your CSB, I always recommend that there be an odd number of CSB members, not including the VP. So that means when all the members are present and you're voting on something, there isn't a tie. However, you might have in your chapter constitution and bylaws that there's 6 members on your CSB plus the VP. So that means there could be a tie. You as the chapter VP, You're chairing the meeting, which means that you're coming to the meeting with an impartial voice, you're presenting the facts, and you only vote in the case of a tie, which is the same as if a chapter president had to come and vote in the case of a tie in an election or something like that. The size of your chapter standards board can and should vary depending on the size of your chapter. So at Phi Chapter, originally we had, I think, 5 members on our CSB, but we went through a huge member growth. And so we went from, say, like 30 members to 60. So we significantly increased that number to make sure that it wasn't, it was proportionate to kind of the size of our chapter. We like to say a good standard to follow is 10 to 15% of your chapter should be reflected on CSB. So if you have 50 members, you would have 5 folks on the CSB. We don't want there to be less than 4, just so that there are, enough voices on your chapter standards board, and that, it's not just, and it's also like not the whole membership too. So exec members, when it comes to executive members of your chapter standards board, in your constitution, like I mentioned for Phi Chapter, we actually had specific officers who were designated as required to sit on our chapter standards board. And it might vary, your constitution might say it just that 3 of the members of your standards board need to be executive members, but it might not say it has to be the secretary, it has to be the treasurer, and it has to be sisterhood officer or whomever it is. So just make sure that you're, doing that however you see fit. Not every exec member is going to want to be on CSB, but if you are very clear in your position descriptions that the chapter treasurer will always sit on chapter standards board, then folks know as they are going to run for those positions that they will have to serve. So definitely recommend that being documented in your constitution for officer, position descriptions. Recommendation is to have a balanced number of exec and non-exec members. So like I mentioned before, 3 and 3 might be a good balance, or 2 and 3. It just kind of depends on what you feel works for you. And if you find that something's not working, change it. Any questions on this part, on like who serves?
Would you recommend having exec members on CSB?
Yes, absolutely. I would 100% recommend having at least 1 or 2 exec members on CSB. And if you care to know about the position specifically, I would say someone like your chapter treasurer, someone who might be able to, or a secretary, someone who might be able to, communicate or share, like whether someone, say, is late on a dues payment or has not attended certain functions or whatever, like someone who might be able to keep track of some of those requirements that come up, in a chapter standards board meeting, when you're, talking about someone not meeting requirements or something like that. The other thing is your chapter president should never serve on chapter standards board. They can maybe sit in on meetings, maybe act as a parliamentarian, but they should never have any voice at all. Does that help? Cool. All right, let's move on. So how should chapter standards board members be chosen? I always recommend that these members be elected if possible. So the entire chapter has a say in who serves on the chapter standards board. What ends up happening when you get into appointments is, sometimes folks might think you're playing favorites, or the chapter exec board is appointing people that they think will, just be their friends and make sure that, nobody is held accountable or whatever. So I really like to make sure that folks who want to serve can say they want to serve. So maybe they apply for a position and then are elected. So just like if you were trying to, put your name on a slate of candidates for specific positions in your chapter and be elected, I would definitely recommend the same for chapter standards board for those general members of the chapter who might want to serve. The president should not appoint the chapter standards board members. And if the chapter does choose to appoint members, the executive board as a whole should probably decide on who those folks should be, whether they take a vote or whatever it is. That's like at a minimum. But I highly recommend that your entire chapter has a say in the members of the CSB. Questions on this? This is also something where I feel like by electing folks, you're going to be able to hopefully, have folks who, number one, really want to serve on the board, but number two, hopefully reflect that diversity in your chapter. So diversity of voices, everything. And hopefully folks want to serve. I don't know, it's kind of a funky board, like, to be a part of or a committee. But at the same time, like, I think it's really important stuff. But yeah. Questions? Okay. All right. So what's expected of members of chapter standards board? Number one is confidentiality. All of our CSB members should maintain confidentiality. Don't talk about decisions outside of CSB, just like don't talk about Fight Club. There's no such thing. It's not that. It's literally like you could be speaking about things that a member doesn't need or want anyone else to hear about, whether it's a personal issue or problem. So all these meetings should be confidential. I would recommend having members of your chapter standards board kind of agree to or sign a confidentiality statement, just saying like, hey, I know as a member of CSB that I must maintain confidentiality, and I agree to that. And I know that if I break it, X will happen. And hopefully this is something that you have kind of set forth in your constitution as well. Like if a member were to break confidentiality, what are the consequences? Next is to really treat individuals fairly. I know it's sometimes really hard to be impartial, especially with friends. But I think one of the unique parts of being on chapter standards board is really like trying to be impartial, trying to really just treat individual members of the chapter based on the Constitution, based on your chapter procedures and everything. I'd also recommend follow standard procedures in your decisions. So if two people were to come to the chapter standards board with the same issue, and there's no like crazy extenuating circumstances, those decisions should probably be in line with each other. We don't need, if it's like, oh, I didn't meet my service requirements and other person didn't meet their service requirements, but only I got fined and they didn't, like, there's probably an issue there. The other thing is follow applicable national procedures. So because chapter standards boards really do help determine membership status and vote on some of those, it's going to be really important to follow national procedures around things like disassociation to ensure that it doesn't get overturned, or if someone is salty about it in appeals, that you have all the documentation necessary to say, yes, this person is okay to go on leave of absence, or we support them, or no, we don't want to give them a dues waiver because of X. Make sense? Okay. All right. So chapter standards board meetings, two separate things here. How often should you meet? I would recommend at least once a month, but you might have to meet more often or less often. Whenever there's an issue to take care of, meet. It doesn't necessarily have to be before or after a chapter meeting. It can be hopefully a standard time that you all agree to as members of the chapter standards board. I know for me, we used to meet after chapter meetings like once a month. And so folks always knew if they were going to be, quote, called to standards, like, or asked to, come and meet, that it would be on X date. It would always be the second Monday of the month or whatever it is. And always know meetings can be canceled if there's nothing to discuss. So like I said, at least once a month, more often than not at the beginning of a semester, you're going to need to meet potentially more regularly, especially with membership status requests and all of that kind of stuff that happens at the beginning of a semester. Maybe you'll have to definitely meet halfway through a semester, just checking in on if folks seem like they're on track to meeting requirements. And then probably, definitely near the end of a semester when folks are likely to not meet all requirements or something like that is what would probably happen. Questions about how often you should meet? Okay. What format should chapter standards board meetings follow? I would recommend, just like in chapter meetings, that you follow Robert's Rules of Order. Not only does this help provide a standard agenda and format for each meeting, you can always have the option to revisit business that may have been tabled from your last meeting, or maybe you needed to research or get more information. It's always the same format. So I would 100% do this. It also helps keep folks on task and make sure that voices are heard and given the same, they're given the same time, the same consideration. Absolutely take minutes, or if it's a virtual meeting, record it. It's very important that when a chapter standards board is voting on something, that those votes are recorded and noted. It's also very important that if you're meeting with a member, that discussion is recorded in a way to where if, say, they appeal to National Standards Board on a dues waiver or whatever it might be, that you have all the documentation on your side to say, this is what we discussed and this is how we voted. That's it. You as a VP should always lead the meeting, like I said, and should present all the facts in an unbiased manner. So this, again, is something that's definitely hard to do, especially when you're dealing with friends in your chapter or, whatever might be happening. It's hard, but it's also something that's very important, because if you are showing that impartiality, the rest of the board will follow in your footsteps. Questions on this? Cool. So in summary, I only took 30 minutes of your time, but then we can have just an open discussion. Just make sure that your chapter constitution and bylaws reflect how you actually operate your chapter standards board. So like I mentioned before, make sure that you go back and check these, make sure that how you choose your members to serve is properly reflected in that, how you operate, all of that good stuff. Your CSB is going to operate, however your chapter thinks it should operate. So like I mentioned earlier, the way my chapter operated is different than yours, than the next chapter. It could be really similar, who knows? Definitely consider voting members into serving on chapter standards board to ensure they reflect your chapter membership and the needs and wants of your membership. Follow those standard operating procedures, take and keep detailed records, and just make sure confidentiality is at the forefront. we don't need people's tea getting spilled. So that's really all I have for you right now, but I wanted to open it up for questions from both of you and just see if there's anything that's top of mind, even if it has nothing to do with chapter standards boards, but something else like within your role as a chapter VP that you're worried about or that you're just questioning, and just want to make sure that you are ready to go and serve and hit the ground running and be able to thrive this semester. Looks like it's just you and me, Madeline.
Yeah. I don't know. I don't have really any questions. I mean, other than I know my last vice president, like for CSB, I know she like took minutes.
Mm-hmm.
So I kind of like watched her because I was
Good.
always in CSB. So
Yeah, that's good. I think that's really important. Minutes and notes are just, oh, like
yeah.
it's so important. I mean, especially say you're like dealing with a disassociation or something like that, and you know, it if especially if they're salty and come back and like try to appeal, like as long as you guys have the detailed records of everything that you know, was presented and everything, like then it's easy for the National Standards Board to uphold or, you know, say, yeah, you guys did what was right here, like whatever it might be. So totally get it. But yeah, notes are key for sure.
Yeah, I'm definitely one that documents everything because I forget a lot.
Yeah. Well, and
But
it's just like hard. I just feel like, I don't know. Does your chapter do like a lot of fines or anything like that? Or do you guys just kind of like, oh, you have to do XYZ to fix whatever? I don't know.
we always refer to like our constitution and bylaws when we're going through stuff.
Mm-hmm.
And then we just know like kind of like the XYZ of what to do. So it's kind of nice because our president, she was our president last year,
Oh, good.
and so she's our president again. So she knows a lot from last year that she's helping with us this year.
That's awesome.
So
That'll be really helpful. I know I was our chapter standards board like chair the semester or the year previous to when I became chapter president. And so that was really helpful in like just being able to go about everything. Like I felt like I had a good foundation to be able to like lead the chapter because I had to know all that stuff from the Constitution and everything is standards board. So
yeah.
it's good. What's the makeup of your standards board right now? Like, how do you guys do all of this?
We usually do elections at the first meeting.
Oh
So
God.
like you know, we have the whole meeting and we ask them, hey, is anyone interested in joining CSB? And then we give the brief overview of what CSB is because some
Yeah.
people don't know. And then we usually, you know, we do 2 executive board members, and then the rest will be just people that are interested in helping. So,
Very cool. That's awesome. Yeah, I know at the beginning of the semester for us, and it might have changed. I mean, I've been out of school for quite a while, so when it was when we like put our chapter standards board together, it was really like the first meeting, like you said. Or we would actually the last meeting of the year or the semester previous, we would start taking like applications because that meeting we would see it as being like the first meeting that the new board like took over type thing. So we would let folks start like putting their name out there if they wanted to be on chapter standards board or serve on any other committee or whatever. So it was kind of nice. Hopefully it's not like pulling teeth to get folks to volunteer, but you never know.
yeah,
Do you find like it's hard to get folks onto chapter standards board or to serve in other like roles?
I mean, sometimes I know like for this year to get people to like do like alum liaison or like
Mm-hmm.
academic chair, it was kind of like pulling teeth. I was like, okay, who wants to do it? Like,
Yeah,
So
it's hard. It
but we
can
did
be
have
hard.
people step up. So
Good. That's awesome. So Gia, I didn't know if you had any questions for me or if you had anything else you wanted to like talk about or whatever, but we're just kind of chatting through Madeline's experience.
Yeah, sorry, my internet is really bad because it's like storming.
Oh no.
So it like keeps cutting in and out. But I had um I had some questions on like how to write or like amend our constitution.
Yeah.
So our executive board has been like looking at it and like going over, like we went to EB retreat this summer
Mhm.
and went through like the whole thing. Um,
Oh no.
I hate when storms do that.
I know. I live in
went
Phoenix.
through.
Oh, there you go. There you are.
Oh.
Sorry, we lost you there for a second.
uh, I was just saying I didn't know if like everything that we saw that needs to be changed has to be voted in or out or whatever.
Yeah. Okay. So I have many ways that there's many ways that you can go about this. So it kind of depends on what type of changes you're looking to make. So if they are kind of like sweeping crazy changes that people may potentially, want to discuss, have some pros and cons about, I would highly recommend, well, regardless, if you have like things where it's like, oh, we just need to change this to make sure like it's more of an administrative change, it's an easy change, it's how we've been operating, or you have those things where there's like bound to be discussion, I would recommend you have sort of two sets of proposals. So this is how we do national stuff. I was on the national legislation committee the last 2 years and we put together this whole process. So what we do is we review all of those edits that get submitted, like all of the proposals, and say, hey, this is just an administrative thing. It's to make sure that things are operating the way that we need them to operate, or how they've already been operating and we just haven't made the change yet. That kind of stuff goes on what we call a consent agenda. And what a consent agenda does is groups all of those edits together into one big, long document, one for the Constitution and one for the bylaws, because your Constitution to change it should have a completely different vote percentage that you need than your bylaws. So nationally, for example, our Constitution needs a 3/4 approval and our bylaws needs 2/3. So it's a little harder to change the Constitution than the bylaws. So what I would recommend is you have two consent agendas where it's like, hey, take time to review this, give folks, all of these changes ahead of time, review them. These are literally just administrative things, include any rationale as to like why these changes need to be made. But then you can vote on them as a slate of changes as opposed to individually, which takes for freaking ever, right? That's how we used to do it. We used to have anything and everything all like as open discussion and everything. And it made it like absolutely hellish. The second thing that you would do is have those discussion agendas. So the things where it's like, if you as an executive board or somebody else in the chapter wants to submit a proposal to change something, and you know that it's potentially going to be a sticking point, or there's, controversy, or, there's just going to be like heated opinions, then put that on a discussion agenda. And each of the items on the discussion agenda will be considered individually. So great example at National Convention, our consent agenda had a bunch of stuff on it. Both of them were approved very quickly and easily. Our discussion agenda only had 4 items on it, 1 for the Constitution and 3 or 4 for the bylaws. And it was all stuff where we considered as a legislation committee, hey, these are things that are kind of foundational changes to how we operate. So we want to make sure that everybody gets a voice here and can discuss them and bring those pros and cons to the table. So that's what I would recommend. So G is having kind of that 2 sets of proposals, your consent, which, you know, you as your chapter would consider as a whole, and then those discussion ones, like if anything where you feel like it's going to be big major changes. And I'd be happy to share kind of our templates and how we've done formatted all of that nationally, if that's of any help to you.
Yeah, that would be great.
Awesome. Yeah, I know they're still potentially on the website, like the actual agendas themselves. But it's so easy to format everything. And I love the format that we use now because it gives folks the ability to see how it reads currently, what it would read like with the changes that are proposed, and then what's the rationale, like the explanation for why we want to make this change or why we suggest it. So it's pretty easy. But yeah, I can make sure that we get that over to both of you guys if you want them. Super easy. Well, what other questions do you have, Soji? I know you said you potentially had others.
I did. I like came prepared and now I've forgotten all of them.
All good. I know how that goes. I feel like
Yeah.
that's been me for like weeks now.
I don't know. It's just kind of strange being in a new position.
What other positions have you held, both of you?
I've been on CSB for like a year and a half.
Okay.
I have been the alumni liaison for also a year and a half.
Okay. Cool. And Madeline, what other positions have you held?
I was secretary for a whole academic year. I did alum liaison along with secretary, and I did academic chair. So I was both all year, and then I did CSB for a year and a half.
Cool. Well, at least you guys both have that chapter standards board experience, you know, to kind of pull from. You kind of know like how it typically goes and everything. So hopefully it's not too crazy. What else can we talk about? We still have like 15 minutes. I don't want to waste your time either.
With our statuses, so I know like they're not due to nationals until September 15th, but like I don't know if this is like a stupid question, but like what's the best way to get people to submit their status forms? And because like before then, because our previous vice president told everybody for like the last 2 months of school that they don't need to do it until like the 15th of September. So nobody's really submitting them. And I've been trying to get them to do it and they just like aren't. Like I have like I have 7 and there's 29 girls in our chapter.
Yeah. So one thing that I always recommend is like communicating with the chapter. Like these are the national due dates. Like I, as the chapter VP, have to have this in to HQ by September 15th. Therefore, I need all of your stuff by 2 weeks before that, hopefully, if possible, so that as a chapter standards board, if there's any issues, we have time to discuss them. Otherwise, you're going to have 0 time, right, to consider any LOA requests that might fall out of, you know, the typical norm, and same with alum, like whatever it might be. Then you have the time to consider it. So I mean, you're the chapter VP now, right? So I would go back and say, hey guys, this was wrongly, you know, not wrong, but, you know, miscommunication. I actually need them by this date. You know, I need them for these reasons. And if we don't get this in on time, like our chapter could be, you know, you don't want to make it like sound super bad or anything, but, you know, like our chapter could be, you know, like it's not going to be good for us. We need to make sure that we have all of that, because not only does that help you guys, right, like in understanding who all do we have to collect dues from, same nationally, then we know who all to collect dues from. So it's kind of like a matter of process. And then I would also kind of write that into a process for your chapter too, of these things are always due by X date. So make sure that you have what you need at least, 2 weeks ahead of time, so that you have time to consider all the extenuating factors that might come in.
Yeah, because I know like our EB was talking about like having them in before school started, or like by the first week of school. And I was like, that would be great, but nobody's doing that. Even though
Yeah,
and like the reason for it is because our retreat is the first weekend of school, like right after school starts. And
like
so
your
our
whole chapter retreat.
yeah.
Okay.
And then our recruitment is like the week after that. And so those two directors really wanted to make sure like that they're not making people go to these events who aren't going to be active. And I'm like, yeah, I don't want to do that either.
But people are still considered active until they're not.
Yeah. And that's what I
So
told them. And they're like, well, we could just let them be like act LOA. And I was like, I don't think that's right.
yeah, not right. For sure. Not right. Yeah, I would say the earlier that you can get them, the better. I mean, things always change, right? Like
Yeah.
halfway through a semester, something might happen for someone and they have to leave, go on a leave of absence. Perfectly fine. But folks are still active until otherwise. Like it's the whole same of like you're innocent until proven guilty. It's the same thing. Like you're active until you're not. So I would definitely recommend trying to get as much as you can prior to school starting, if possible. We used to actually start asking folks who are at the end of last semester. Like, we know things change over the summer. Like, what is your expected status going to be for the fall? And then, if anything changes, let us know. But this is, try to like get folks trying to be a bit more proactive about it. I know it's hard. So easy to say, be proactive, but in practice, it's tough. But that would be a recommendation from me. Don't let national deadlines be your deadlines.
Yeah. I had
For
another
sure.
question. I didn't
Yeah.
know if this is something you can answer though. This is just kind of like a general, like, not membership, but like status question.
Yeah.
One thing in my chapter that has been happening like the last like 3 years, like since I joined, which was fall or spring 2020, is that our like a lot of our seniors tend to do the LOA semester and then alum semester, so they're not really like ever active their senior year.
Mhm.
And it's just kind of like a thing that keeps continuing, and we're losing these like large groups of people. Like when I joined, it was like almost 50 people, and 25 of them left that spring semester because they went alum that semester. So it's kind of, and it's happening like again in the spring this year or next year, where we're going to lose like a third of the chapter. And so I just didn't know if there's like a way we can like gently nudge people not to, like not to, but like to say, hey, it's not the only option. Like,
Yeah, and I think that's one thing to always communicate. It's not the only option. I feel like every chapter has this issue, right? Where I know I'm a senior and I'm graduating in June, and like I've got capstones, I've got to do like whatever, the crazy projects that you get as a senior, all of that kind of stuff. It all kind of comes to a head the last year in general, not even just the last semester.
mm-hmm.
Um, one thing that, like you said, communicate, like it's not the only option, right? Like being a member shouldn't be so much of a stressor on someone to where they feel like they need to take a leave of absence because they're not going to be able to meet the requirements. So to me, that might be something to where you go back to your constitution and look at those requirements too for all of your members and say, like, in reality, is this something that is achievable for someone who has the hardest course load ever? If it is too much, then maybe that's something that you as a chapter need to consider. You know, maybe your individual service requirement is a little too much. Like, I don't know what it is for Alpha Zeta, but you know, maybe that's too much. Maybe that's a hard part for them. Maybe it's, you know, having to be at meetings every week and like everything. Like, I don't know what it might be. I don't know what it is specifically, right? That is keeping folks from wanting to stay active. But of course, we want to encourage them to stay as active as possible. The other thing is to help bolster that huge, you know, decline in membership that you're going to end up seeing is really going crazy right now for this fall recruitment. Get as many members as you possibly can during the fall so that when you do have that, you know, dip, you've got these new folks that will take that place, or maybe you get more than that. That's always the goal, right? Is to try to recruit way more than you might be losing per semester for alum or whatever it might be. So again, easy to say, hard to do in practice sometimes, especially depending on your campus and your chapter and how you typically recruit. But I think those are two things that are always, at least were always top of mind for me, was, are we recruiting enough members to keep our membership levels stable across semesters, or like +1 or 2 as opposed to like -25 or whatever. One year it was like +30 and it was insane and we didn't know what to do because people didn't want to take littles, because people think that it's some like crazy thing now, like where you have to do all of these like amazing like things for them. Like, no, it's literally a mentorship. It's not like you don't have to buy a million gifts, things like that. So just always consider those things. Like, don't have some of those things in the Constitution. Like, really, it's like the foundational stuff that should be there as requirements. And then like, if you want to add more, great, but definitely consider like what those requirements are on folks and like if it's sustainable for, like I said, someone who has like the hardest course load of their life type thing.
Yeah, I think like part of our problem too is that people like plan it for it, like when they join, like some, like I don't know who, like if it's just everybody's just, but like they'll, with like new people who activate and stuff, they'll just, as soon as they activate, they're like, yeah, I'm gonna go LOA and then alum my last year. And they're just like, you just activated. How do you know that? Like,
Yeah.
but with the points, something that REV wanted to know was like if we could have like kind of like senior points where the point totals are lower, like our service points would still be at the national minimum, but like our sisterhood and like fundraising and stuff, if we could lower them for seniors specifically in their last semester. So it's still a
So
cool thing for them to do.
it's actually something that we've considered on a national level, is like that senior status type thing. It's not a membership status though. So it's not likely something we would say, yes, you can do, because it essentially creates a separate membership status. And only the membership statuses that are recognized in the national constitution can be recognized at chapters. So I hope that makes sense. Like, I'm all for it. Like, if it means that they would stick around and stay longer, but it technically can't work the way that we currently operate nationally at
Okay.
chapters. If that does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay. Because you're essentially saying like the requirements are different for certain, and how do you consider someone being in their senior year? It could be all over the place.
Mhm.
Because for me, I graduated in 7 semesters, not 8. So was I a senior? Which semester was I technically a senior? Is
Mhm.
it by credit hour? Is it by like, who knows?
Right.
So, you don't want to get into that junk. What else? We still have like 4 minutes here. Any other crazy questions? None of your questions have been dumb at all.
How would I be able to like pitch having exec members on our CSB? Because we went over it because I was telling them about it in our first EB meeting of the summer, and they're like, no, we don't want to be on CSB like at all.
So the
So,
way
like-
that we kind of pitched it, I'm going to admit somebody to our session really quick. The way that we pitched it when I was at Phi Chapter was, hey, look, as chapter secretary, you have all of the attendance records for chapter meetings. Hey, as service director, you know if someone's meeting their service hour requirement or not. Hey, treasurer, you know if someone is meeting their financial obligations or not. You three, like, we need you as members of this committee to be able to provide that detailed information. It's much easier for you to serve on the committee and have that information and present the facts than for us to say, we need all of this information ahead of time to, like, as we're considering, member A's issues. That's how we pitched it, was like, look, we were already going to have to reach out to you anyway. Would you rather just like serve and be able to provide all of that in real time, or like add more to your plate when we have to ask all of these questions and stuff? Also, I feel like chapter leaders sometimes like worry about, like, I'm already super involved, so like it's going to be more of a pull on me. I don't think it is. Like, being on CSB, it shouldn't be like more. It's literally just like it's a part of the role. Like, you have info that we need, kind of a thing. I don't know if that helps answer your question or not, but that's kind of how I would pitch it, is just like, help me help you.
Yeah.
Makes all of our lives a little easier. Plus, you still need like leadership voices on the board, like on your standards board. So, yeah. Well, if there's nothing else, it's been a pleasure to talk to both of you. I'm so sorry again, I'm not on camera and my voice is all crackly, but it's been awesome talking to you, and I will make sure that you guys get those legislative like proposals and agendas and kind of like how we do that on a national stage, so that you guys can maybe utilize that for your chapters. Cool. Well, I appreciate it. I'm gonna hit stop recording.